All right, everybody, everything is good and we're back. I want to mention a couple of things, so thank you so much for anyone who stuck around and stuck through. This will be appended to the thing on YouTube. That way we can, make it go through and get some interesting continue the interesting insights, or what I think are interesting to think about. Something I want to mention about the medtech is that the medtech is kind of really, really similar to a unit that we had in Little War Game called the Priest. The Priest has the ability, and this will sound very familiar, similar to the Nanoswarm ability. The Priest had the ability to put down, or still has, the ability to put down a healing ward that itself can be destroyed and targeted, and it heals biological units inside of it as long as they remain within it. Now, I want to notice that this was actually so incredibly powerful that it got nerfed multiple times. First, the rate of healing inside of the nano swarm, or in this case, the healing ward, was nerfed. Then the area of effect of the healing ward was nerfed. Both of these were nerfed by about 40%, which is almost half, and that's crazy to think about. So almost half the healing, almost 2/3 of the area of effect that they used to have in terms of their ability to heal units, and they now only heal biological units. And the priest's building was made more expensive, right? And all of these nerfs were actually necessary because it turns out that priests, there was another faction in the game called Beast, and priests that pushed with healing ward and were, placed spaced appropriately, you couldn't kill any of the units inside of the ward. Now, you might think that you just run away and come back again. But the problem is that that invincible mass healing army would just get closer to your base and closer to your base and closer to your base and closer to your base. And eventually they're on top of your production. You have to take the fight. And you have very low tech units that actually can't do enough damage to out pierce the problem that the healing ward would provide. So I would be very interested in seeing if the medtech is in fact extremely powerful or overpowered even. Again, it looks like it has good natural synergy with the Exo and the Lancer, who we've talked about for various reasons. The Lancer in particular, because it doesn't need its ability to do the AoE, right? It doesn't need the kinetic reconstruction to have AoE damage. It just looks like this is going to be a very good, like, bulky support unit, and it's weird to think about support units being overpowered. It's also hard to say because we haven't seen the gameplay. We don't know the cost. We don't know the supply. We don't know things of this nature. But just by the abilities and effects alone, the Nano Swarm looks not like it's going to be great against a human player because they're either going to focus target down the individual unit that is giving the Nano Swarm, or they're going to run away from the fight, similar to what we saw in Little Wargame. But again, this is different. Stormgate has creeping. Nanoswarm looks like it's absolutely insane for creeping because the AI aren't intelligent. Or if they are, their reasoning can be argued with. You can place your units and interactions in such a way that you get the maximum value out of it. So I would really pay attention if I was a Vanguard player to studying how to maximize creep, because the speed is great against opponents, and a lot of people will be coming from a StarCraft background, so they'll be thinking about how to use my speed to go harass my opponent. But there are neutral objectives that you can advance the game state by not interacting with your opponent, or rather, not interacting with your opponent is itself an interaction with your opponent. And so that's where I would be looking at for this. Also, note the physical size of these medtechs, right? Notice that the Lancer actually looks like it's smaller than the Medtech. Like, these are two Lancers, and it looks like we would need like another two, four, six, maybe even like seven or eight to get all of the units all the way down here, right? Looks like we would need like 8 units to make this wall. Notice how thick the Medtechs are. You could probably stuff this whole wall with 4 or 5 of them, or at least make it a compelling case. And obviously, we all know the graphic that was shown earlier last year for Stormgate, in which they have medtechs with atlases behind them, and they lose that fight, but they look like they're doing a pretty good job, right? So this would be one of my candidates for unit to really look at and see if you can make overpowered, especially if there are stacking abilities. Right, if you can stack the healing that the medtech has, right, is the maximum. This is in Little Wargame. We use modifiers. We use the thing called max stack, right? What is the maximum stack of nanoswarm that you could have? Could you have 5 nanoswarms on a single unit? right? Could you instead not, but have 5 nanoswarms on 5 separate units that are all physically close together? Do they then all get the benefits of this nanoswarm? System shock, I think, is going to be used for the most debilitating debuffs, and there are a lot of open questions as to what debuffs and buffs System Shock applies to. I mean, I don't know how much was cut off in the previous video, so if at the risk of repeating myself for too much length, I'll just go over a couple. System Shock removes buffs. Does this remove Nanoswarm? It seems likely. Does this remove temporary stuns or slows? Like if you get stunned up by a Vulcan or slowed by a Magmadon, does this affect that? Does this affect passives? Like the Nanoswarm looks like it does some minor AoE damage over time. Does this remove it? If you target an opponent with System Shock and they don't have a buff, does it still work on them? Are you allowed to miscast in this way? Are you allowed to cast it on an ally that doesn't have a debuff on them? These are some of the questions I would have with System Shock. But let's go on to the next unit.
Buffs from enemy units or remove debuffs while increasing movement speed a bit for friendly units. You can kind of think of it as a better version of the StarCraft 1 Medic's restoration ability. Let's talk some about the worker unit for Vanguard, the Bob. Bobs are very similar to SCVs from the StarCraft world. They build structures, mine resources, and repair things. They do have a bit more complexity to them than an SCV, though. Similar to Age of Empires, you can use multiple Bobs to build a single structure. This will speed up the structure's build time and adds an interesting balance to economy versus speed. There's also an ability on the command post, which is similar to the command center from StarCraft 2 but doesn't fly, called Bob Overcharge. This will strengthen your Bobs in the immediate area for a limited time, making them more sturdy and able to defend themselves. Now let's talk about the mechanical units, also known as mech units.
Before we get to the mechanical or mech units, thank you, Artosis, we're going to talk a little bit about the Bob. So the Bob has 130 hit points, and I want to notice a couple of things about the overcharge. So that overcharge from the command post created a blue, like alpha 2, alpha point 2, like bubble that expanded out. And you could see the range that affected all of the Bobs within it. So we have a couple of questions with regards to that. Is there a delineation line outside of it? And what I mean by that is, can I activate that and then take Bobs and use them similar to how peasants become militia for the human faction in Warcraft 3 and use them to go take out creeps? Can I use them for an all-in? Now, this matters because we saw that the overcharge in the game that was presented lasted from 51 seconds to 1 minute 12. So this overcharge lasted 21 seconds. That's a very long time in RTS terms, especially when so many other of the Vanguard factions and units talk about movement speed, debuffing your opponents, buffing your own more notably. So if this lasts 20 seconds, this has some pretty stringent requirements on maps in its current implementation. One is that you can't have, except for a deliberate point of map focus, you probably can't easily have double bases. Like, because if the command post area doesn't have a delineation, like a circle after which the Bob that is affected by the overcharge can leave and then no longer be affected by the overcharge, then there's probably some case to be made on certain maps, certain builds, to have your command post straddle and be a little inefficient between mines or between resources, but then make it so one command post can cover all of your Bobs at a single time, right? That's just mana efficiency right there. And then with the multi-build, Overcharge plus multi-build, first off, Overcharge is so strong that we saw it. Like, we saw Bob surround and eat a Magmadon in the DreamHack Atlanta games, right? So this doesn't make Bobs, it looks like it makes them a bit tankier, but more importantly, it looks like it just gives them an ability to completely wombo opponents. And Overcharge plus multi-build means I don't really know how you, without huge commitment, attack and kill, or without repeatedly triggering the overcharge, get damage. This reminds me a little bit of my perspective on, or my what I was seeing when Protoss had the mothership core, and the mothership core had photon overcharge. And especially for Terrans who were trying to use medevacs and drops and things of that nature, right? You would overcharge. You would attack, they would overcharge, and then you would have to leave and come back and attack later, and you would have to force the energy to be drained. So this makes me think that a large part of playing against Vanguard is forcing them to use their overcharge, because this is also probably a defensive tool, and as such, I would be extremely, overwhelmingly disappointed and surprised if enemy mobs were affected by this overcharge, right? This looks like a stop tower rushing. And part of the reason that it probably has to stop tower rushing is multi-build. So we had multi-build in LittleWarGame. And the problem with multi-build, and the reason it was ultimately removed from the game, was that you could be very greedy and then just rapid fire make a defensive structure, right? If you see that someone is coming down and they're barreling through you, they could have a good attack, they could line up all of their pieces, they could have a good, like, hit good macro cycles, and then if they come to attack and defensive options are good, you just rapid build, and rapid build is often paired with rapid repair because it's easier to make. Oh, build is taking a unit's hit points and setting it from this point to this point in an increasing line. Repair does the same thing. It's just that when you're done building a unit, it can then have functionality. So it's common enough, it looks like, in other games. LittleWarGame also had this issue to have, if you have mass repair, if you have mass build, those same workers have implied mass repair. And then mass repair also means that doing any amount of damage that isn't permanent is wasted opportunity cost, especially because in this game, creeps, right? So I don't really know how you harass these mobs other than draw out the overcharge, or you hit them with something at a range. So we saw atlases earlier, right? Um, if you are getting hit by atlases, and don't worry, we're going to talk a lot about atlases because they're basically catapults from LittleWarGame. If you're attacking the mobs from a distance or they can't surround you, then the overcharge is still good defensively, but it's a reaction check, right? It's a reaction cast, a reaction check. And I'm really worried about how you attack mobs, actually, because we saw that the command post seems to have 4 bars, and it looked like in DreamHack Atlanta that each one of those bars represented one overcharge being possible. And if I suspect that the overcharge is going to end up being like Chrono Boost. You should always be using it unless you have a plan for when not to use it, right? And so this makes me think of, do you just overbuild mobs, overcharge, and use them to clear creeps, right? Beyond, do you turn them into a pseudo combat unit, right? So that would be my concern with mobs. We had some things like this in LittleWarGame, but nothing quite like it. I am a little bit concerned that anytime you give people a good defensive option like this, yes, you do stop early game, or you hinder early game cheeses, right? Because if your mobs are 3 times stronger than theirs and they're trying to tower rush you, you're probably going to be okay, right? But I do worry about how economic that makes the game. We'll have to see more.
For the Vanguard.
Now for mechanical units.
Mech units are made out of the Tier 2 structure, the Mech Bay. First up, we have the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog has the fastest base speed in the game, and you can feel it. Its high responsiveness and quick hit-and-run abilities are reminiscent of the Vulture in StarCraft 1. There are a lot of differences, though. It shoots 1 to 4 missiles in quick succession, but then has to wait for a period to reload these missiles. This makes player activity with the Hedgehog extremely important. It should almost never be sitting still. It's all about the hit and run. The Hedgehog is fantastic at maintaining map control in the early portions of the game due to its ability to out-micro all the other early game units. In StarCraft 1, the Vulture is known for being terrible at destroying buildings or larger units, but being excellent at destroying lighter units like Zerglings, Zealots, and Marines. The Hedgehog is just the opposite. Its damage acts more as a large burst, being fantastic at assaulting buildings and eliminating larger units. The Hedgehog also hits both air and ground, and has an ability that you can upgrade called Hunker Down. Hunker Down turns the Hedgehog into a stationary anti-air unit similar to a missile turret. This greatly increases its anti-air range and gives it a faster ammo recharge. This will root the hedgehog in place and eliminate its ground attack, so use with caution.
Okay. I hate this ad. We're going to skip this ad. Skip. I've never downloaded this game, nor will I ever.
Next.
Referring to Hero Wars, of course. Okay, so we're going to go over the Hedgehog. There are some things that if you were clicking and looking, you could see that are a bit different. The Hedgehog has 230 hit points, and he stated, Artosis did, that it has the fastest base speed in the game. I want to notice something about its damage. So 6 shots dealt 70% to a Lancer, which looks like they do 11.5% damage per Hedgehog. Keep in mind that a Lancer has 200 to 250 health. If we assume 12% value, then we're doing either 220. Rather, it has about 200 to 250 health. So we're either doing 22 or 27.5 damage per shot, or per volley, I guess. Optimistically, in terms of your defense against it, it's doing 22 to 27.5 damage per volley. If they're really strong, it's 22 to 27.5 damage per attack. I want to notice that also at 2 shots dealt 50% to a fiend, which is a worker equivalent, but it didn't really. It did 50% equal to its 50% equal to its veil, equal to its white bar, and white bars are typically 50% of the value of the unit, right? So we have some idea that if that unit was a fiend, and a fiend is like a bob, and fiends I believe are 90 and 45 based on what you can see from the DreamHack session, right? Then these did about 22 damage in 2 shots, which kind of indicates that 22 to 27.5 is a per volley, unless they do different amounts of damage to light and biological, to light units or biological units or small units, whatever the damage types are in the game. So the hunker down, I want to note that this is probably given because mech struggles to deal with air without having its own air units. One, it becomes stationary, but it retains the same hit points. It doesn't seem to have extra armor, and in fact, we haven't heard anything about armor. And we haven't seen anything in the unit profiles and portraits that indicates that armor exists. I'm sure armor types exist, as in types such as light, types such as biological and mechanical that we know exist, right? But I don't think that armor, as in hero armor, normal armor, light armor, fortified armor, things of that nature, or actually work. It wouldn't surprise me if we get a lot more of the StarCraft size comparison damage modifiers. I want to note that the Hunker Down ability does 30 to 40 damage per volley, and that's again using the bar is 50 hit points metric, and then tracking it through. Looks more like it's about 30 damage than it is actually 40. I want to note that units like the Hedgehog with very, very high base speed tend to get completely wrecked by anything that has CC. So like a Magmadon's charge, a Vulcan's hit. They also look like they want to move together in packs, right? Because what you care about with units like this is the amount of damage that they deal and how it relates to thresholds. So I'll give you an example from LittleWarGame. In LittleWarGame, the soldier does 18 damage and workers have 120 health. You don't really care about that interaction. But if you have +2 attack, soldiers deal 20 damage and workers take the full 20 damage and have 120 health. In this case, we care about how much damage we're doing because that is now 6 attacks from a soldier kills a worker, right? These damage thresholds are really what we care about with the Hedgehog. I want to note that the Hedgehog also, because of the way that it's built with the volley, and despite its speed, doesn't look like it actually wants to deal with this pack of small units. I mean, Artosis specifically made the example of vultures are good against light units like Marines and Zealots and Zerglings, although, we didn't really see that in terms of the Hedgehog. We saw it attacking a Magmadon, we saw it doing seemingly full damage to a building, right? But I've also seen the DreamHack Atlanta games when we were watching Vanguard versus Infernals, and again, it looks like they're better harassing units than they are defending units. I'm getting kind of the same vein as what some, like a prankster gangster style use of wolves or snakes, right? This is a unit that also, I want to say on a meta level, we could probably read into this that hedgehogs are a very, very strong unit, because part of this was not said explicitly to me. I'm putting on my hat here, part of the media strategy of putting out this information about the various factional units for Vanguard and then for Infernals is probably informed by a desire for people to know what they're looking at when they get into the beta in February, when they're watching the $10,000 tournament in February, when they're watching all of their favorite streamers from a variety of games play, when they themselves get into the game and are playing for the first time. And so, on a meta level, Artosis talking about the Hedgehog this much, if we just note the time in video, it seems disproportionate. Maybe he really likes vultures, and that's why he put in the effort into the comparison. But I suspect that what's also being subcommunicated here is the Hedgehog is a very strong unit. You need a plan for dealing with Hedgehogs. And actually, on the cast, Tasteless and Artosis were talking for DreamHack Atlanta. Tasteless and Artosis were talking about how TLO, when going for hedgehogs, seemed to be going for what was meta, right? Or for the Vanguard faction. So I suspect that hedgehogs are very, very strong. Everything that I said about Exos and Lancers and how they're probably really good at creeping is actually less the case for the hedgehogs, even though I think they're better at creeping. And let me unpack that statement, right? That's like me going to the airport with a suitcase that's 500 pounds, and you're like, sir, you have to lower the weight restriction on this. You have to get the brain thoughts untangled. Hedgehogs are clearly faster than Exos. Exos get a plus 25% movement speed buff over 2 seconds every time they attack. I mentioned when talking about Exos, there's a possibility that they excel at creeping, because if there are a lot of melee units, they might be able to kite them out the entire way and take minimal or no damage, right? Which implies that there's a lot of range. These hedgehogs look like they have pretty good range and some kind of sub lock on ability, and they're very, 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 very fast. Now, one thing I want to say is that that should, in theory, make them better than Exos. They have 80 more hit points than Exos. They seem to do more damage than Exos. They're hella faster than Exos. But creeping is also standing and delivering, right? Is standing and dealing damage. And also, there's the idea of opportunity cost. It's probably not a good idea for me to take 7 Exos by themselves and walk across the entire central portion of the map to go poke my opponent. Because if I do that, there's a bunch of things that could be faster than me that could surround me and kill me, and then that's a huge lost investment. I probably want some kind of unit like the Evac to carry those Exos to make them safe. I probably want to have like a base lined up to an attack path to make sure that they have an easy retreat. I probably want to make sure that they have all of their upgrades so they can kite and then get back to a place of safety, or maybe give the equivalent of a bunker that they can hunker down inside of. Uh, that means that the Exos, in economics, they talk about comparative advantage, right? This one school of thought is comparative advantage. The comparative advantage for the Exo is of creeping is it probably wasn't safe for it to go out into the wild by itself anyways. So it's not like you're really missing out on a lot of damage opportunity with the Exo. But if we think about the Hedgehog, it is so fast that making it hold still to creep, even though it's better at creeping than the Exo, by all accounts and what we can see from this video, you're missing the opportunity cost of dealing damage to your opponent, of dealing damage to their buildings, of getting scouting information off of them. That's relatively free because of the high base movement speed of the unit. So I actually think you could creep with the Hedgehog, but mechanical units tend to come from a different building. Mechanical units, and we've seen that explicitly in this video, mechanical units also tend to have a higher build time to justify their power. And so if you have a unit that takes more build time, probably more resources, probably rarer resources, is less massable, is higher up on the tech tree, and is this fast, you probably don't want to use it to creep. You probably want to use it to go apply pressure and gain map knowledge, and affect your opponent, right? So that's all I really want to say about the Hedgehog. We do have some comparisons to units in LittleWarGame, such as the Gatling gun, but not quite, and the Ballista, but not quite. See, the Gatling gun in LittleWarGame is not the fastest ground-based unit. It is not appreciably faster than everything else. In fact, even after its speed upgrade, it is slower than units like the Snake and the Wolf, and it is not crazy faster than Raiders, even. So Gatling guns ignore armor and so are pretty good at hitting buildings in the same way, but really what you use them for is to have a thing that can be repaired that is fast enough that it can also kite, and so in that way it's similar to the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog's ability to transform through its hunker down ability reminds me of the Ballista in LittleWarGame. The Ballista in LittleWarGame, before it gets its bonus that allows it to deal AoE damage and have an activated ability, it's also just doing good baseline damage against flying units. It's the game's premier anti-air unit. I want to note that actually we see later on in LittleWarGame you can pick up the Ballista inside of an airship and ferry it around. Hunker Down, just by the name of the ability and how it looks like a turret, like it looks solidly in place, implies that you can't pick it up with an evac and then use it. However, you can pick up an Atlas, which is in siege mode, and two of them in an evac and move it around. So one thing I want to know for the Hunker Down ability is, can I pick up a Hedgehog, which is still technically a unit, and when it's in its Hunker Down form and carry it around in my evac? Because if I can carry around my Hedgehog in its Hunker Down anti-air form in an evac, then we have some huge potential to grief opponent air units, to chase them down, right? And that's going to be a huge source of micro potential. So notice how I said the medtech looks like it has a lot going for it. That's probably a support unit that if I was looking for something that's overpowered, that would be the place that I would start focusing on. And I would focus on not just its abilities, but how to use it. One interaction I would look for that could be extremely potent is I want to see if the evacs can pick up the hunker down hedgehogs. If they can, that would be extremely potent. I know because I've seen it in LittleWarGame. It is unbelievably strong against air units, and that's in a game that seemingly has much stronger air units than are in Stormgate by design. Let's go on to the next unit.
We have the Vulcan. The Vulcan is a very important mid-tier tech unit bridging the gap between the speed and maneuverability of the Hedgehog and the slow sieging power of the Atlas. Honestly, I'm not really sure if there are any RTS units to compare the Vulcan to. None come to mind for me.
Okay, I do have one from LittleWarGames, which is why I'm glad I did this video.
And it really kind of feels like its own thing. The Vulcan is not particularly fast, but it is quite strong. It is a chain gun that takes some time to spin up, but does a cone of area of effect damage, which is perfect for taking down large groups of light units like Fiends. The Vulcan also has an upgrade called Jump Jets. The Jump Jets make the Vulcan dash forward, dealing damage and stunning an enemy for a short time. These jets can also knock down trees to quick...
I want to note, actually, something that we didn't, it wasn't explicated here by Artosis, but did you notice the small bar right there of blue haze and energy and the fact that there is an Atlas over here? This strongly implies that, well, he's about to show that the jump jet ability of the Vulcan can clear through trees and clear through terrain, right? Destructible terrain, right? This is their implementation of destructible terrain. I want to note that the Atlas, that blue shell right over here that was firing, and the damage over time that it was dealing, seems like the Atlas can also destroy terrain.
Clear a path in or out of closed areas of the map.
Yes. Okay, so before we get on to this next unit, the Atlas, which is, oh my gosh, it's just the catapult. I love talking about it. Let's go into the Vulcan. So there are some facts about the Vulcan that you may not have seen that were in the video, but I'll explicate. So the Vulcan has 350 to 400 hit points, again, using that idea that each bar is 50 hit points and that the last bar could represent 20, 30, 42, 1 hit point, right? So the Vulcan has 350 to 400 hit points, which makes it about 3 times, 2.5 to 3 times tankier than an Exo, and about double the physical ability of a Lancer. We saw a fight with 5 Lancers against 2 Vulcans, and the Vulcans didn't look like they were suffering damage-wise, even though they were eating AoE the entire time. I want to note that actually the Vulcan's large size makes it really good for body blocking, and will make it easy to catch itself. But I also want to note that it negates some of the effects of AoE. This is something I haven't heard people talk about before, is that a unit that has a large body size is effectively negating your opponent's AoE, because when it lands on them, so much of their body is being covered by the AoE that it leaves little space for the AoE to hit elsewhere. So if your opponent has Atlases or Magmadons or something like that that has an AoE, stun or effect or can affect an area, the Vulcan is actually quite an excellent absorber of that damage, right? It acts more like a tank, as in the tanking World of Warcraft sense for your party, in your team and your army. I want to talk about the jump jets upgrade for a little bit. Yes, breaking through the terrain is the visual thing that has been emphasized. That was shown by Kevin Monk, I believe, in his games against TLO earlier in 2023, and we didn't see much of that actually on screen for DreamHack Atlanta, though it was very much implied that something like that was used in the TLO versus Mana game where the Infernals broke through on the first map into the center double mine. I want to note that Jump Jets does 50 damage and stuns, and the duration of this stun seems to be about 4 seconds, like 3 to 4 seconds. This is very good, but it also seems to only impact one unit at a time. So you're not going to be jump jetting into a worker line and stunning the entire worker line, right? It just doesn't look like it has any AoE. We saw them jump jet into a group of Lancers that are themselves like tightly bundled up together. So this implies that it is a one-time, one unit, one thing. And so you're going to use this ability, Jump Jets, to disable a key tech unit, right? You're going to disable a Magmadon. You're going to disable an Atlas. You're going to disable an enemy Vulcan, provided, of course, there are no restrictions on what your Jump Jets can actually affect and whether there are any size items, like force fields and ultralisks kind of interaction happening here. I want to talk about the Vulcan. I actually do think it has a pretty good analog in LittleWarGame to the Werewolf. Now, not the current Werewolf. The current Werewolf is a strong tanky, a tanky frontline unit that has a smash ability that can blow enemies away from its center and deal damage in doing so. But there was a while where the Werewolf didn't actually have this ability, and it was removed in favor of giving the Werewolf AoE. Now, the Werewolf was still tanky, but every time that it dealt damage, it dealt it in a circle around the struck area, because that's just the way that AoE works. It wasn't in a cone. It's nevertheless pretty good. And the Werewolf there was an okay unit. I mean, its smash ability was later returned to it because it was iconic, and I will say that unit actually struggled to justify its use in a lot of cases, because an AoE auto attack unit is either extremely strong or gives your opponents too many opportunities for outplay and counterplay. You would just position your units in a way that you weren't impacted by the AoE. I do want to say that werewolves in that state, and even in their current state, were very strong against worker lines, and so I would expect that Vulcans are probably a good drop against Bobs. Not as good as an Atlas. An Atlas just chunks and does huge damage, but the AoE and the fact that there seems to be a range a range of about, in LittleWarGames terms, like 2 to 2.5 of the ability, and the fact that Artosis specifically said that it fires in a cone of damage makes me think that actually the Vulcans are pretty good at being dropped and doing some damage to worker lines or their equivalents. Doesn't look like it's particularly good at, um, because it's not fast. I don't really know how this unit gets brought in. Again, werewolves. The way werewolves get brought in current LittleWarGame is that werewolves, if you don't race to them, right, if you get to them eventually, they're a rounding out compositional unit. And if you race to them, you're telling your opponent, you don't have the right anti-units right now for this. You don't have enough stuff to deal with this. Therefore, you will die because this thing is a giant ball of stats. So I want to know how far up the tech tree the Vulcan is, because right now in LittleWarGame, we have werewolf drops. You get, I'll put it in Stormgate terms, you get a Vulcan and an Evac, and you drop them, and you use the micro potential of the Evac and the tankiness of the Vulcan to make sure that the unit doesn't die. Now, in LittleWarGame terms, that's you put a werewolf in an airship and do the same thing and harass workers until your opponent dies if they have a suboptimal response. So I want to see if there are any glass cannon one base builds that do this. Because the other thing is, when you try and kill your opponent, if they're doing that in LittleWarGame, your opponent just laughs because they build some defensive towers and they wall off their base and you celebrate. And it does look like there are ramps inside of a lot of these maps, at least the ones that we have seen thus far for Stormgate. So I would be curious in seeing if that's actually the case, if that continues through. Now we're going to get on to the final unit.
As for the mech units, we have the Atlas. The Atlas is very similar to StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2's siege tank. It isn't particularly fast or strong while mobile, but once you deploy its BFG mode, its range and damage both increase by 4 times or more. Unlike StarCraft's siege tanks, you can target ground to fire upon.
Yes.
Because the Atlas's shot is not an instant guaranteed hit like siege tanks, this might become an important tactic as the game evolves. The Atlas also has an upgrade called Plasma Arc Infusion. This makes the Atlas's attacks set the ground on fire for an additional area of effect damage on that ground for a limited time. And one more thing. Remember tank Evacs from StarCraft 2?
Yep.
The Atlas can be transported in an evac while in its sieged mode to greatly increase its potential damage both in battles and during harassment.
Okay, cool. So before he goes on to the next one, I want to talk a little bit about this because we actually have something very, very similar to the Atlas in Little War Games. But first, a couple of stats about the Atlas that you can get if you were just watching the video over and over and over and over. So the Atlas has 250 to 300 hit points, and it looks like it does about 16 damage unsieged against the Lancers, and it looks like it does about 50 or 60 damage in a damaged fall off area of its circle of effect, and this was against Bob. So it looks like units in the center of that ball take more damage than units on the side of the ball. This is different than what we have in Little War Game, where we just have flat damage if you're inside the area of the catapult attack. You take the full damage. It doesn't matter if it barely nicks you or if the whole boulder lands on your head. The BFG mode also appears to have minimum range. This is probably just good design. You don't really want to have a unit that is this powerful that doesn't have its weaknesses, and it does look like it does friendly fire damage, even for its damage over time effect. Now, the target ground. This is something that we have in Little Wargame with the catapults, and I will tell you that target ground was brought in, I want to say in, 2016, something like that, was when catapults first had target attack ground. And it works the same way. You choose a point. Your opponent in Little Wargame doesn't see what the point is that you're targeting, right? They just kind of have to follow the rocks and use their best judgment. And you could choose to hit units that are retreating. You can choose to hit worker lines that are a little bit farther away than your auto attack. You can choose this. What was mostly used for was hitting structures and buildings such that you get bonus damage. You hit two areas instead of one. So imagine you're attacking a building, right? You're attacking this Coke bottle, right? If you just attack the Coke bottle, it doesn't matter if you have AoE, you're hitting the Coke bottle. Now imagine you have the Coke bottle and the Gatorade, right? And they're together like this. Well, if you just attack the Coke bottle, you're only hitting the Coke bottle. But if you attack ground this area right here in the center, you're damaging both of them. And so that was one of the common uses for attack ground. Another common use of attack ground is hitting units that aren't there. Like again, if you're beyond the fog of war for workers, you hit that. If you suspect your opponent is building something somewhere, you do that. In fact, one of the things that was very common was to attack an opponent's tower as it was building, right? And then Q fire to try and hit the worker that was building it, because if you kill the worker, then the tower's not going up. But obviously, if you kill the tower, then that's value enough in and of itself. The Plasma Arc Infusion, where it sets the ground on fire, this sounds kind of ridiculous in the context of what we know about Little Wargame. So Little Wargame, one of the most powerful tactics in the game, something that people still talk about possibly nerfing, or how you can redesign the game to accommodate that this is a reality, right? Depends on how extreme they are. Most powerful tactic is to take an airship, load up to catapults inside of it, and then attack a worker line. In Little Wargame, for a long time, we didn't know or didn't understand that the catapult as it was could kill a worker in 2 shots. And because mines in Little Wargame work very similar to the way that the resources work in Stormgate, the workers pile up into an area. And so if you AoE attacked one of the workers who was mining, you would actually end up hitting multiple workers at the same time. And then if you had 2 catapults, those units just die instantaneously. That's it, it's over. Now, that has been nerfed to the point that 2 catapults attacking, if they get both of their shots off, don't kill a worker in Little War Game. It leaves them with a very small amount of health, right? It's 58 times 2, so it leaves them with about 4 health. Okay, so you can see that you're getting attacked and then react to it after you get attacked without an immediate punishing result. I want to say that the AoE over time from this Plasma Arc Infusion is going to kind of present a lot of problems, I think, for Stormgate. It would not surprise me if Atlas drops are already extremely powerful. Also because, just like in Little Wargame, Artosis was talking there about how, well, remember tank evacs? Yeah, you can pick up a sieged Atlas. Well, in Little Wargame, catapults are by definition always sieged, but there is no separate siege mode for catapults in Little Wargame. They have minimum range and they attack very slowly, right? But they always have their max range and they're always effectively sieged, right? So I've played with that, and I can tell you that While it's not instantaneous damage, it is a huge part of the metagame. You do an obscene amount of damage. There is a lot of value placed in Little Wargame on how you control your airship and how you make sure that you use the Q fire to not let your opponent know that you're there and yet still get some value and some damage because of the AoE, right? There's a lot of micro potential, but really the number one area I would worry about the Atlas. And if I was looking for things to be like meta defining, I would be focused extremely hard on how do I integrate always getting these drops. It is now kind of a commonly accepted thing in Little Wargame that whether you're playing humans or you're playing beast or you're playing mech, you are at some point going to want catapult drops. There is no army that a couple of catapults doing drops on a worker line doesn't improve. And in much the same way, this looks like something where you kind of need to have atlases, if only to have a couple within an evac so that you can go ahead and deal this damage. And this is even in the face of dedicated anti-air units such as the ballista, even in the face of flying units that can otherwise do damage such as the gyrocraft. We're going to talk about the Hornet. We're going to talk about we've already talked about the hunker down ability of the Hedgehog. I suspect that until it gets nerfed, a high level play in game state will Vanguard will always, always, always involve having atlases, being cognizant of where atlases are, and making sure that the evac is in no way overpowered. Right? If I were trying to win, that would be a unit I would focus on more than the med. That is an interaction I would focus on more than the med techs, and maybe even more than the creeping. Although I think more people are onto the idea that this is a very good worker harassment tool, especially since it's explicitly shown in the video, than they are onto the idea that creeping is more powerful than they think of, and how Vanguard's movement speed means it's actually the fast aggro race, even though it looks like Terran, and that's the association people make in their minds.
Lastly, let's talk about Vanguard's air units.
Air
These
units,
are
let's
flying
go.
units made out of the hangar bay.
Okay.
First up is the Hornet. This is a relatively fast flying unit that hits both air and ground. It reminds me a little bit of the StarCraft 1 Wraith. It's mobile, but ultimately you don't really want to fight any anti-air ground units with it. The Hornet has an interesting ability which you can activate that sends it.
Okay, before we get on to the things that are new about the Hornet, I want to talk about some of the stats and some of the things we've seen in Little Wargame. So the Hornet, to me, looks a lot like a gyrocraft. If you're not familiar with Little Wargame, just gyrocraft is Hornet. It's very close to it, right? The gyrocraft is a mechanical flying unit that does 12 damage per hit in Little Wargame. And so you need 10 hits of it to kill a worker, and you don't ever really want to have a straight up fight with it against any unit that can attack air. Other air units tend to be better than it, although it is a fast unit, the Gyrocraft. You don't really want to have battles with other air units with it. It's at best a mild deflection, and there's two ways of playing it. You either get a ton of them and try to ruin your opponent, because even though it's not got great anti-ground, it's good enough if your opponent doesn't have enough to deal with air to win the game, but more commonly we see mech players get 5 or 10 of them for harassment and as anti-airship patrols, and I think the Hornet will be in much the same place. The Hornet has 100 to 150 hit points. It seems to be doing about 10 to 16 damage per shot. Again, we see that it's attacking an anti-air creep camp, or a mantis that is a resource camp level 2 and doing a pretty bad job of it. And so it looks like it is the gyrocraft, the rules that the gyrocraft will apply. And so I want to mention a bit of that. One of the common ways that the gyrocraft is used in Little Wargame is as an opening gambit by a mech player, either as part of their pre third base tech, like their second base pre third base tech, or as an evolution. So let's talk about the first one. Mech in Little Wargame tends to have a variety of good air attacks and force a lot of anti-air responses. One of the ways that they do this is they get their first couple of units out, they defend their natural, they have a second base, and then they either go for a fast third, but more commonly what they do is they go for this gyrocraft play. Because if your opponent doesn't have any anti-air or is skimping on anti-air to be more economical, you can do a lot of damage. And because they're mechanical, they can be repaired, which fits into what Artosis is about to talk about, which is the return to hangar bay ability.
back to the closest hangar bay. Once you hit this ability, it can't be stopped. The Hornet will increase in speed greatly, go towards the nearest hangar bay, and stay there until it's fully healed. There's also an ability called Sky Mine, which deals area of effect damage and slows enemy air units.
Okay, cool. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So, some implications of the return to hangar bay ability. It seems like it is grabbing the nearest one, and then the Hornet blitzes back to it at increased movement speed. So, what this means to me is that this is a skirmishing unit. You take a fight with it, you run, and then it heals. Again, very similar to what happens with the gyrocraft. You're not staying there to take a full fight. You're staying there to harass, pick up some of the pieces, maybe help with some air defense, and then you can, in the case of the gyrocraft, repair it because it's mechanical. In the case of the Hornet, you can run it back to the hangar bay. I want to note that because this is uncancelable and goes to the nearest hangar bay, that this is probably really, really, really good as a proxy, right? Again, it matters how far up the tech tree it is, but it wouldn't surprise me if we have something like, double Hornet Rush or something to this effect. Because think about this, the micro required to keep it safe is merely to press return to hangar bay in a position where you know that the bonus movement speed will get it back. Now, this will give a small advantage to the defender because they'll know what the location of any of your proxies are because it's uncancelable, uncontrollable. The unit runs back to that and you can't access it again until it's fully healed. So that'll be very offensively powerful. But because it goes back in that beeline fashion, I would suppose that this gives you information about where the proxy is, right? This also, if you put it in a clever place, like just over an air gap near someone's third that leads right into their natural, or third that leads right into their main, or over a cliff or something like this, or any map where the air distance between two main bases is faster by a significant portion than the ground distance required. Like imagine that map where you have to go all the way around for ground, but you could just do this to go straight up, right? I imagine Hornets are very, very powerful there. It might be a little finicky to have to control the Hornet and only after it gets back up to full health. And we're not talking about the rate at which it actually returns to full health. But by all accounts, this is a mechanical unit. So you can put the support unit, they're going to talk about the Sentinel. You can probably put a Sentinel next to the hangar bay, right? Put a Sentinel next to the hangar bay and then have the passive hangar bay effect on the Hornet of return to hangar bay and the Sentinel healing of mechanical units affected at the same time, unless it deliberately dispossesses the unit or removes it from other consideration, right? And also, just a funny thought, this part where it's uncancelable, is that a debuff? Because if that's a debuff, if the you can't control it, is if that's a debuff and the medtech can remove it, then effectively you have a only limited by control ability to get bonus movement speed to get your stuff out of dodge anytime that it's going badly, and then you can just remove the debuff that makes it uncancelable and is sending it back to the hangar bay and send it out again. So you actually can like make the Hornet into a mini interceptor. I want to talk about the Sky Mine. So it looks like the Sky Mine costs, I'm saying 25 mana. Really, it's 25% of the mana. And it says that it does AoE damage and slows enemy air units. So this reinforces that this is probably going to be used less as a harassing unit and more as a point defense. It's going to probably lean more into the gyrocraft anti-air defense because of the Sky Mine ability, not because of the AoE, right? In fact, it looks like deliberate care has been taken to make sure that air units are worse than they were in StarCraft 2. And it also looks like extra care has been taken to make sure that they don't clump, which is part of what was making them powerful. But the slow enemy air units is more about making sure that they can't retreat, right? And that's the value of the Sky Mine, right? I could see you putting this like a point defense drone out around possible drop locations, and then if it dies, oh, I guess I know what's happening here. This is similar in LittleWarGame to the Gatling gun's caltrop. The caltrop is only something that you can drop after you get the advanced workshop. So essentially it's an upgrade of the Gatling gun, and it slows units by, I think, 90% of their speed for 5 seconds once they run over it, but running over it consumes the caltrop. So essentially the Sky Mine is a caltrop in space. For anyone who's watching this who does little wargame stuff, I want you to think of the Hornet as a Gatling, not as a Gatling gun, as a gyrocraft that has access to a caltrop. That sounds like a good unit, but notice that we saw the speed against the placeholder Infernal's flyer. It doesn't look like the Hornet is that fast. In fact, it's noteworthy that it does have debuffs for speed, and it gets faster when it's leaving, but it's deliberately not controllable at that time. So I don't think that this is some kind of air version of the Hedgehog, right? What you're probably using this for is as an opening gambit to make sure your opponent isn't being too greedy, right? Get some damage done, and then you use this on patrol or an equivalent movement scheme to make sure that you don't get dropped to death by evacs or ruined by your opponent's flyers, right? Probably just a good, effective opening tactic if you already know you're going to be going into mechanical anyways. It would not surprise me if this is a unit that is, in terms of percentage of games made by Vanguard, very high percentage. In terms of relative army size, right, the amount of your army that this unit takes up, very small, right? Very, very small.
Next is the Evac.
Hi,
the
Evac.
is basically the StarCraft 1 dropship.
Yes.
Unlike the StarCraft 1 dropship, though, the Evac has a movement speed upgrade. This will help it to get in and out of dangerous situations a lot faster.
Okay, that is gonna get nerfed, right? I'm just telling you from LittleWarGame. When before you're like, oh, it's LittleWarGame, it's a browser RTS. No one plays that. We have multiple people who have won prize money at tournaments who are Grandmaster level. Some barely, most clear above Grandmaster level, right? For North America and EU. And that movement speed upgrade is like insane. And the reason I bring them up is that I've seen the things that those people can do in LittleWarGame with the airship, and the airship has 3.68 movement speed, which is 0.68 movement speed faster than what is considered fast on the ground, right? And there's been talk of nerfing the airship because it is so dominant, so prominent, and so powerful to make it have like baseline 3.0 movement speed and then get a movement speed upgrade to 3.68. Now, having played functionally, all of the little war games that we have played with the airship are with it just passively having this benefit, just passively having the bonus movement speed. I'm going to tell you, this movement speed is crazy. I mean, I saw how quickly it was picking up those atlases in the clip. This is either going to get nerfed or it's going to be put on a cooldown or something. Just statically giving the ability for control to make your atlas drops more powerful looks like the most insanely cracked thing I could even possibly imagine using. And in fact, I think a lot of little wargame players are going to have a benefit if they go into the Stormgate beta and they just keep in mind the power of airships and the power of catapults and how those are mimicked inside of Stormgate, for exactly this reason. Because we've basically been living in the airship meta for, let's see, six and a half years now, right? So here's your chance, Hydra, AC, and Haffy. And obviously also, I don't know if he's a Grandmaster, but Rhinus, and I know he's a Grandmaster, and congratulations to that square root of -1. It looks like catapult drops are just even better in Stormgate. And just abuse them to the fullest. I wish you luck.
Lastly is the Sentinel.
Yes.
The Sentinel both looks and feels like a science vessel from StarCraft 1.
Okay.
The Pulse Inhibitor ability slows enemies by 50% for a short period while stunning mech units for the same time. The Sentinel Adept upgrade increases energy regeneration and unlocks the Haystbot Dispersal aura. The aura increases the speed of ground units by 20%. Lastly, we have the Sentinel Master Augmentation upgrade.
Okay.
This also increases the energy regeneration and unlocks Nano Defense Bubble. The Nano Defense Bubble gives a 50% damage reduction. Think of it like the StarCraft 2's Sentry ability, Guardian Shield. So that's all.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Artosis, for that. We're gonna nail the final one here, the Sentinel. So both, I want to note a couple of things. So Pulse Inhibitor looks like it takes 50% of the mana of the Sentinel to use, and it slows units by 50% for a brief amount of time, but stuns mechanical units hit by it instead. This seems like it is a balance mechanic. Like it's weird to call it that, but it looks like this is deliberately made to say we know mech is very strong and that they don't care about being slow when they're already slow, right? So I want to know if the Sentinel's Pulse Inhibitor can help hit evacs, right? That might make in Vanguard v Vanguard, that might make the Sentinel something that you make as a counter to these Atlas drops. I think Atlas drops are still going to be so good that everyone should be doing them first and defending them cleanly second. And it says slows units by 50% for a brief amount of time, but that's not a counting of seconds. We don't know exactly how long that is. And the area of effect looks like it's only hitting 2 or 3 Lancers. So it doesn't look like you can hit it and then expect to hit a swath of the army, right? It looks like this is more hold off, like disable key mech units but really slow down from harassment or anything. And that's important because Vanguard units are fast. Vanguard units are extremely fast. Adept Upgrade, again, we see this theme of not wanting to give additional mana, but instead, or energy, but instead to increase energy regeneration or mana regeneration. We see that with the Adept Upgrade and the Master Augmentation Upgrade. The Adept Upgrade increases the ground speed of units by 20%. I want to note that increasing by percentage is extremely unbelievably powerful because these things stack, right? Okay, so here's why this is kind of a concern to me. Lancers can get up to 50% bonus movement speed for 5 seconds, okay? And it's a ground unit. If the Adept Upgrade Hastebot Dispersal Aura hits the Lancer, is it getting an additional 20% of its 150%? Because let's just pick the example of 15, right? Is it getting, instead, if it has 10 movement speed and it's going up to 15 because it gets 50% bonus, is it getting +2 or is it getting +3 movement speed, right? Does it count the buffs that are already stacked upon it? This is something that really, really only matters, I think, for the Exos and the Lancers. Really just retreating Lancers. And Sentinels fly, so they're probably good at retreating as well. So I worry about that. I also worry, since it's called an aura, it gives the implication that there's just this area that is now impacted by this. Like, is the right thing to do? How long does it last? Are we supposed to use this adept upgraded Sentinel to set zones of speed control, make like a mini creep highway? It remains to be seen, right? And then the Master Augmentation upgrade, 50% damage reduction. Again, I don't see anything in this that indicates that there are armor. There are probably at best damage types that impact different types of units or sizes of units, which was used previously in StarCraft 2, differently. And 50% damage reduction, this is one where you want to sit down with the editor or sit down in a game and figure out who is the steel type Pokemon equivalent, right? Who has the most resistances? Who has the most immunities? Who is most focused and its highest priority? And then you want to focus on hitting the nano defense bubble on those units, right? Um, I would definitely want to take a look at the 50% damage reduction and try and marry it with what is the thing that gets the benefit of the damage reduction the most. Um, the Lancer looks like a good candidate because the more damage it takes, the faster it gets. But obviously, things that are static look like pretty good candidates as well. Like the Atlas, again, looks pretty good. The nano defense bubble seems like it affects the ground. Air units weren't shown. And it also looks like it affects an area, a wide area, but an area. So it's probably more. This is probably an ability that'll allow you to take a straight up head on fight when your speed is not generating enough value. You actually have to take a full army engagement. And of course, it's called Nano Defense Bubble, and I think defensively in general. So I'm thinking about how potent this would be on using it on your Bobs. Is it better with the bonus, with the double increased mana regeneration or the energy regeneration rate of the Sentinel? Is it better to use this for your Bobs than to actually activate Overcharge? Does it stack with Overcharge? Like, anytime you have percentages, this is something a friend showed me with Cyberpunk 2077, is you have to be really, really careful that your percentages in a PvP game aren't stacking in such a way that you are making multiplicatively better things, multiplicatively better, right? Some things I want to compare this to is the Sentinels uh, slow is very similar to me. In fact, the percentage it deals is even similar to me. To the slow aura or the slow field that mages cast. It looks smaller than the area that mages cast slow field for. In LittleWarGame, mages are mostly used because they have fireball, they have a chain ability, like they have the ability to chain AoE lines of damage, and there's not a limit stopping them from going over one another and stacking. And so that is the most common use, but at high level, we do see some people experimenting with using a mage field or a mage's slow field to slow down air units or restrict travel paths, or to use an army that would otherwise lose in a straight up fight but prevent the straight up fight from happening. You know, they have a mage archer, which in Stormgate terms would be something like Sentinel Exo, right? You would kill me if you could get to me, but I'm going to slow you, so you're never actually going to get to me. The increased ground speed of units we don't really have. The closest that we have is the sprint upgrade for the Wolf. And while that is gotten for the Wolf in LittleWarGame, that tends to be a I'm winning this hard. There's not really any huge speed tiers that you're hitting with Wolf Sprint that you weren't hitting before, especially since there are downsides to using Wolf Sprint. You have reduced movement speed thereafter. It has a 40-second or so cooldown, and as long as the cooldown isn't crazy for the haste bot dispersal aura, I think it's actually, man, is it better to have it on the unit or to have it on the area? Again, it matters how long it lasts. If this thing lasts for a minute and you can just use it to make a haste bot highway, right? An HBH, right? A haste bot highway between your bases or up to the next creep area, then sure, this looks good. If it's just you throw it in an area and it helps you retreat, I'm honestly not too sold on it. I think the most important part of the adept upgrade is that it gives you the extra energy regeneration, and that it probably we can suspect it's an upgrade requirement for the master augmentation upgrade. All right, let's have him send it off.
All of the units in Stormgate so far for the Vanguard.
Yes.
Hope that you've enjoyed watching my takes on these videos and the units that they kind of resemble from some other RTS games. I always find it really useful to look at new RTSs like this to just have a base understanding to start. Obviously, these units will evolve and change over time. And
yes, it's a beta. No one should expect that this is going to be the final balance of any of these things.
Aren't exactly like their counterparts in other games, but I hope that this has helped you out a little bit. If you have any other questions or thoughts, please do leave comments down below, and I'll try to get back to you.
Well, thank you so much again, Artosis, for letting me react to this video. That means a lot. It really does. There are some final things and final thoughts that I want to get onto before we go ahead and cut the stream, and then we go ahead and send this up on its way over to YouTube and let people tell me that I'm horribly wrong about everything, or that I'm the most insightful person that they've met since this morning. Oh, wait, they were looking in a mirror. Oh, damn. So, a couple of things that weren't mentioned that we could have found by poking around a little bit, pausing the video. So, I want to notice that the rows are selections of 8 for UI. If you're from LittleWarGame, you're used to selection sizes of 9. If you're from StarCraft, you're used to size selections of 8. It also provides a good ability to see the unit portraits and have differentiations. And I want to note that the maximum supply that we saw multiple times was 300, so 155 of 300, 198 of 300. Now, this doesn't mean that there will be 300 units, but this might mean that 300 is, it could also be a custom map meant to show the purpose, but it seems likely that 300 is the actual supply limit that we're going for here, and rows of selection sizes of 8 will allow you to show 24 per, like, box, essentially, while at the same time letting you know what each individual unit looks like without having the wireframe of something like Brood War. I want to note a couple of other things. So we got to look at the starting building health when a mob is building a building, right? And the starting building health we saw was 2.25 bars out of 24. This means that you probably start anywhere from 8 to 12% of the unit's total, 8 to 12% of the of the building's total health when you start building it. Every RTS has something like this where there is a starting hit point threshold so that the building doesn't just start at 0 and then die. What we really care about is what that percentage is so that we know how good is building up something in someone's face. Some mods have been made of LittleWarGame where you had 30 or 50 or more percent of the building just automatically fully made right out the get-go. And if you have that, that's kind of... it turns out that that's really good for the defender. It allows them to make quick walls. It allows them to ignore offensive threats more easily. And so having a low percentage like that indicates that actually there will be some threat to building in your opponent's face, as it were. Final thing I want to talk about is creeps. We did see a resource camp too, and there was a big mantis. It looks like it's 500 to 550 hit points, and it attacks air. It probably also attacks ground. That's pure speculation. That was in the Hornet video section. So with that, again, if you are one of the 0.1 people on the face of the earth who know who I am and have seen my content and you've never heard of Artosis, the link to his video will be put in the description box below on YouTube. If he is live on stream right now, go over there and send him a like, send him a follow, maybe sub if you like watching his content. He's been doing casting. He did casting yesterday, which is how I got into a conversation with him, and then also who can miss the sweet Brood War gameplay? And maybe the donos. So thanks again, Artosis, and I think that everyone who watched this, I hope that this was helpful to you. Today, the date that I recorded this video, not necessarily the day that it's coming out, Artosis is going to be doing something for the Infernals faction. Don't be surprised if I'm on stream later today, going over that video after I've gathered my thoughts and gathered some notes, and presenting that as well. I hope that this makes its way to people who are interested, and even if I'm wrong on all of these things, which I don't think I am, I hope this gives you something as food for thought. I hope that this helps build hype for the Stormgate the closed open beta, as it were, that we're going to see on February 5th to February 12th. And as a nice final touch, really cool that they called the PTR Bisu. I look forward to seeing what the name of the next PTR is. All right, thanks everyone. Take care. Have a good one, and bye.